that doesn't look like myself. I don't recognize myself in what I said or what I... This is not an issue about self. I mean, there is no self that first was on the good line and then was it's really a bunch of thoughts, experiences, actions, their registration, their evaluation, and so on. In other words, there are ways of dissolving these questions about the self in questions about experiences, mental states, actions, decisions, bodily properties, and so forth. Self is a useful noun for all sorts of purposes in ordinary language. But I don't think, I may be in a minority. I mean, there are many philosophers, many thinkers who think that this is serious business. There are classes, very popular, particularly with students. Philosophy of self class, particularly in California, fills an entire theater. Woody Allen has talked about the self in many of his movies and so forth. But I don't think it is a more than I can say in terms of perspective. And most of the perspective that I will adopt, and I think dissolve the selfhood issue in what sort of criteria we have to recognize the sameness of bodily continuity, psychological continuity, moral continuity, and so forth, from outside or internally, either the Humean direction, do I have any experience of a self as an entity? This is what he denied. There is, in my memory, in my experience, there is no entity. I cannot see an entity in myself. The entity is body. Or you take the design mechanism, architecture position, and talk about senses of selfhood. Okay, please.
Yeah, I was thinking there are many labels that people use to talk about different sets of mental skills, like a self-awareness or a self-reflection, a theory of mind. And this self-reflection, you mentioned that was surprising to me, that was children even up to 7 years don't have that. And I didn't know of any of these things that was developed so late. Can you tell me what experiment exactly they used to determine that?
Late development of, well, the introspection, this was in the 1980s, the introspection experiments were developed by John Flavin. This was, I think, maybe a Stanford psychologist, and with collaborators. And he put about 6 to 7, something like that, with questions like, well, it's complicated. The setup was fairly naturalistic, but asking children what they did in the last 2-3 minutes, whether they had any thoughts or whatever, and what were these thoughts, and were, in a certain sense, were not sophisticated experiments, but apparently they converged on the idea that children relatively late have a sense, a sort of disciplined awareness of their own thoughts in particular, not emotions and not lived experiences, more abstract mental constructions like thoughts. And one thing I wanted to mention had to do with a question about metacognition also, which is important, and I think this is where cognitive science is better positioned, at least people who take it seriously, or mind sciences, better positioned than separate philosophy, psychology, and so forth, is putting things together. Notice in my talk, I couldn't finish the whole story, which I think is more interesting than I could give to you because I was running out of time and I was slow. But you have to look at a convergence of developments. I mean, if somebody tells you, well, young children, I mean, these are older children, don't really introspection, don't have a sense of their thoughts, oh, how surprising. But then when you are also told, and this is where the convergence comes in, well, they don't, they don't have autobiographical memory. They don't have this observer perspective on projections, future, past. They don't have this and they don't have that. I used to put 5 to 7 as being a breakthrough, but some psychologist friends who always push earlier say, okay, 4. I give you 4, I stop there. Working memory where all of this happens. Whatever happens, all of this has to happen on working memory. And that takes time. Prefrontal cortex develops massively only after 4. Again, is not a particular mental content or another mental content, but it's the machinery that allows things like that. So when you start looking at the convergence of things, the picture starts to change. Here is another example. Children before the old calendar, the Russian calendar, 5 to 7, the new calendar, whatever, 4. Children prior to 4, I mentioned this, pretty much master the basics of language, phonetics, grammar, basic semantics, meaning of words and concepts and so forth, but are abysmally poor at what is called the pragmatics of language. Metaphor, irony, humor, implicit things that you have to infer and so on, and takes them a long time through adolescence, and some people never get it. Now, if you look at the underlying psychological mechanism of the pragmatics of language, they have a lot to do with what I was talking and with the capacious working memory, with inferential, thinking offline, go beyond what is immediately visible. The first 4 years is just what is registerable, what can be registered in experience. The pragmatics of language is not like this. Humor is incomplete, always. You have to fill in. They cannot do it. So if you start arrows, you have a particular curiosity like introspection. And you look at various arrows that make introspection possible or are correlated, and you enlarge you start realizing that it's not so surprising that that older children cannot do A, B, C, D, and so forth. I always try to look at this wider picture and one thing that I haven't mentioned and was big letters in my, to see them, but in order for you to see, I didn't really discuss the evolutionary implications too much because I was running out of time, but there is one fact that I think should give us all interested in comparing species and discussing evolution and so forth, give us pause and food for thought, which is human ontogeny is absolutely unique in the animal world. So if somebody will ask me, what would you say is the first level of explanation why we are so different or went on a different evolutionary path from apes and other animals, I would say the ontogeny. The infancy is shorter than none of the apes. and that there is a period which now has to be technically called childhood, not ordinarily called childhood, between the age of 3 and about 9, puberty, juvenility, call it childhood, before infancy, childhood, which is unique. No species has childhood in a technical sense. Then there is a few years of puberty, of juvenility, very widespread, and then comes another period that doesn't exist in any other species, adolescence. So you have two periods of ontogeny that don't exist in the animal world. Now, this can't be an accident. This can only be an evolutionary development. Why? I have no idea, but one, clearly there are reasons. And one reason is that in the period of childhood, from the acquisition of language to the pragmatics of language, the acquisition of culture to a good mastery of culture in an anthropological sense, this is a period that distinguishes humans from other species. So to put it simplistically, childhood was invented by evolution to create a new mind. Most of the tasks, mental tasks that children have in childhood are almost eminently mental. They are not tool makers, they are mental in a large sense. They are not hunting, they are not gathering, they are building mental competencies. And this fact is ignored by psychologists, by evolutionary theorists, and so forth, or it doesn't surprise them. I would be immensely surprised if I come to this, and I was immensely surprised when I come to this literature, and now you have a huge tome if you want to study it, by cultural anthropology, the evolution of childhood, and I think it holds a key. This is why I myself refocused the evolutionary analysis towards ontogeny, because I think this is where the big difference, this is quite another story, just occasioned by.
Thank you for this very inspiring talk. And I'm in broad agreement with most of what you've said. Probably, well, we might discuss about that threshold, about the emergence or the maturation of self-reflection capabilities for children. But I want to push you a little bit on the evolutionary story of it. So, and I don't know if you'd agree with this more radical interpretation. In a way, self-reflection, we assume it's about ourselves, and it is about ourselves, but in fact, something that is profoundly social in origin. So is it in a way like we have first developed theory of mind to interpret other people's minds for, of course, Machiavellian strategies, but also for cooperation. I mean, cooperation is pretty difficult itself. And then, because we had this kind of arms race between people with theory of minds, we have developed a kind of meta-theory of mind in the sense that we self-reflect because we know that other people reflect upon our minds, and we need to justify, we need to persuade, to convince, project what other people are going to think about ourselves. So, and in a way, so this is the actual domain for which this capacity has evolved, and other self-reflections on the meaning of life or whatever are just byproducts. Is this what you're trying to?
Yeah, that's. I mean, what you said with this arms race is really what leads to this strategizing. Because this is why I read that long definition, which is an amalgamation of representations of your mental states with the impact on the mental states of others and their responses to which you respond. And so strategizing is really resulted from an arms race and basically expresses a mini arms race in which we engage all the time. In fact, in response to his question, and I think this is an interesting point, is that in many, call them strategic situations, which we are confronted daily, hourly, in interactions, as long as they are habitual or close to habitual, I think the algorithm kick in, the algorithm of strategizing, those so-called intuitions or whatever, and we white lie, diplomatic lie, being polite, and stuff like this. But there could be an ongoing arms race in an interaction in which you realize it's not going to work, or the response of the other person is troubling, or is surprising, like in chess. And in that moment, you shift gears. You get out of the algorithmic game and you start thinking. Now, some people do it well because of a wealth of experience. Other people take time, they get red in the cheek, they mumble and stumble, and so forth. But you can have an actualized, ongoing arms race in the socio-political interactions among people, not just the building up of the competence, but the exercise of the competence. And I think in both cases, self-reflection is there to be the top regulator, except that in one case is how it got there, the evolutionary answer. In the other case is the actual mechanics of strategizing. But I think, yes, I didn't use, I included in the text, I put this competition and the politics that is involved in, politics in a very wide sense, that is involved in strategizing. And the insufficiency, because many people have written about the Machiavellian intelligence of the apes, much more limited and much more online, observable situations. I mean, we still are with the gap, offline intellect versus Machiavellian politics of chimpanzees or dolphins and so forth. And really, a point I wanted to make, there is convergent evolution. I mean, different species in different environments end up getting similar adaptations. This species had tens of millions of years to evolve. And there is no indication ever that they went in this direction. And I think part of the reason has to do with the ontogeny, what this rescheduling of ontogeny responded to. And if you press me even harder, I'm willing to take risks and say, happened probably fairly recently, as recently as you want to get modern humans, perhaps the second wave out of Africa, 200,000 years ago, 130 and so forth. And the dramatic, it's in tune with the idea of strategizing, the dramatic increase in the population, in which dramatic increase in population means a lot of strangers. Whereas we know about most of these brainy species, up to and including Neanderthal, that there were small 12, 20, 25 kin-related individuals. That's not a good recipe for the intellect.
And just an empirical follow-up, should we expect that theory of mind capacity should correlate with the capacity for self-reflection? I mean, they use the same kind of brain architecture and cognitive mechanisms. And finally, just what about neuroticism? Intensive, intrusive thoughts about the self, which seems to be going into overdrive.
About the latter, I cannot speculate. But with theory of mind, with intuitive psychology, I can. At some point, I still believe that is, and I think you probably would will be close, I think is the most important competence we have. Surprisingly, and studied only in the last 30 to 40 years. It's amazing. If it's true that it's the most important mental competence that we have, it's absolutely a shame that almost nobody, beginning with the Greeks, paid any attention to it for 2,000 years. But I went even further, even in print, and I argued that not only does the job that it does, socialize, communicate, and so forth, but it's a mind designer. That is, it enables other capacities to develop. So is absolutely crucial. And I think I mentioned that what I call managing one's mental states is this metamentation, which is part of the brain projectivity and so forth. The operational part, but the conceptual part is theory of mind. So, and the inferences that it allows and everything. So the answer would be yes. I suppose that future neuropsychological research will probably show a significant overlap of resources, including brain sites that are involved in theory of mind, that operate in self-reflection. Of course, we have the much abused counterpart, in which on the wide autistic spectrum, many autistic people are poor at theory of mind and are very poor at self-reflection, which will also, and there are, and if you go with the people that also put theory of mind in the driving seat of schizophrenia, where again, if you have thought insertion and all this, perhaps this will answer a bit your last question. If you have these strange views about the thoughts that you have, you clearly are not in a position to use this machinery of self-reflection, because it's not your thoughts, you can't direct your thoughts, etc. So if indeed, then parts of schizophrenic spectrum and parts of autistic spectrum will further solidify the connection between theory of mind and self-reflection. Yes?
Very interesting and many details on your topic to relate self-reflection to evolution. But I have a question regarding the autobiographic memory. You said that autobiographic memory is related to the first-person view and, surprisingly, third-person view. And for me, it was a great surprise to see third-person view included in autobiography. When do we have a third person? It's not third-person view. In fact, an artificial construction of the first-person view. So it has not the same, third-person view has not the same importance as the first-person view. It's just an artificial construction, so why do we include third-person view?
Well, I tell you, it's not my contribution here. I was looking at the autobiographical memory literature, and they have a number of standardized tests, but even to establish this distinction. And I have to tell you, reading this literature, and perhaps this may have to do with your worry, and I have in the text, but I decided to jump at some point. If you read the memory literature, you'll see two major concepts related to this topic. One is episodic memory, and the other one is autobiographical. And they are largely confused. I mean, lots of people think of episodic as being autobiographical. Episodic means first person. I mean, it's a quasi-perception. You have the quasi-perception of having seen, smelled, heard that, and it comes with vividness and the immediacy, a bit pale, you know, a bit like the actual experience. This is episodic, and I decided to call it, just to avoid the confusion, experiential memory, because it's like an experience. Autobiographical, turns out, I mentioned a bit, comes with much more complexity. Forget about the observer now. Initially comes with semantic data, calendaristic pointers. Imagine what it is to try to reflect, to remember something, and not to have the calendar, not to know how to pass the time. And it will be okay, it comes with extra ingredients, which already tells you that it's a mixture of factors that operates. I cannot tell you for sure from my remembering the literature whether the third person is sort of emerging out of these additional factors or not. But some of the experiments are experiments in which subjects are asked directly and basically are asked directly how they experience past things. And they have ways, the experimenters have ways of noticing the reduction of the lively, vivid element, which will be the first person, and see increasingly, particularly as the time passes, see increasingly an essentialized memory, unable to recover specific perceptual details, but the essentials of the picture. Then there are experiments with the manipulation of memory, which also indicate that as the memory is further away, it's harder to manipulate the perceptual elements because it focuses only on the essential. There are experiments with traumatic events, stress, in which people apparently naturally switch to the third person perspective in order to minimize the suffering, the grief, and apparently is known in the psycho-behavioral literature. So there are a number of pointers to that, and I haven't had time to develop this, and I haven't had time to think through all the implications, but I think I have the premonition that it's a robust phenomenon, particularly if you think not only of recalling, but projections. Projections, because this is the idea with memory now. It projects all the time, possible, future, and so forth. There you can see much more the role of the observer, because you haven't experienced what you are going to project quite often. And I have the premonition that this observer position in mental projections is of immense importance in the human mind, barely explored. If I would have graduate students in psychology or cognitive science here, I would say jump at it, because I think it's going to be a hot subject, and I think it's going to have theoretical and clinical applications. And but it's not, it's mentioned in the memory literature, but this is psychologists don't take the right classes. They don't come to the philosophy department. They don't come to other department to enrich and so forth. I would have, if I were a psychologist and saw a number of years ago this observer position and its implication, who knows where I would be. Yes, please. No. You.
Okay. I was just wondering, since language is cheap and it's symbolic, could that have been the precursor, like a type of language to a certain complexity that would have provided the unique and very strong pressures for self-awareness and theory of mind.
Now, I didn't hear the first, is it apes? Symbol?
Language. Since language is cheap to use and it's symbolic, could that have created that unique pressure and strong pressures for self-awareness and theory of mind?
Well, language is not cheap. I mean, language is the most difficult grammar-based language. Okay, grammar-based language. Communication systems, plenty in the animal world, but grammar-based language is only one, and it's human. And that is not cheap at all. That is an extraordinary evolutionary development. I think the pressures, if I understand your question, is not so much language itself or use of language abstractly, but rather the type of communication it allows. That is, I mean, just think of the pressures, for example, and this is an interesting evolutionary question. People debate whether language has started verbally or gestural. And really the large cognitive scientific community is split in two, gesturalists and vocalists. But let's suppose that it started gesturally, which I think has a few percentages more probability than the vocal. Okay? Well, gesturally is gestural communication, even if it's somewhat grammar-based, it has certain rules and so on, is visible, is experiential, it's more easily decoded and interpreted. Vocal is hard. There is no connection whatsoever between the sound table and this. Whereas if I make something like that, some gestures and so forth, I could figure out what you are talking about. So a vocal language is more symbolic than the gestural, although the gestural is also symbolic, but it's a different degree of symbolicity, clearly. Gestural is it's a approachable symbolicity. Vocal symbolicity is absolutely crazy. There is in no language, almost no language, there is no connection between what is phonetically uttered and what is meant and what is referred to. What is meant being a bunch of concepts, what is referred to is, and when you start with events, situations, not things, it's just madness. So the answer is a vocal language, when it emerged, first or rather after gestural, put that type of communication put tremendous pressures on the mind. And again, I would not be surprised in a sort of fantasy, but not quite fantasy evolutionary story, to believe that early archaic humans, up to a point, perhaps even Neanderthals or so, had a gestural language and could communicate sophisticated things. And when these waves of modern humans showed up, tens of thousands of strangers, it's easier to gesticulate among a small group. It's much harder when you have 200,000 around you. It's possible that the vocal language really took off, like many other things that we discussed. Took off exactly with this modern humanity, with new, including strategizing and so on and so forth, putting with a lot of pressures coming from interpreting vocal symbols. Yes, please.
You spoke about self eventually.
Self?
Self. And you also offered some quotations regarding consciousness.
Conscience.
Conscience. Okay.
Yeah, this is why I even talk to my friends about In English is a clear phonetic distinction and conceptual, but phonetic: conscience and consciousness. Conscience is the moral regulator. Consciousness is awareness, sensitivity, things like that. So I was talking, I didn't touch, I'm not going to touch tonight, it's too late, I'm not going to touch consciousness. This is conscience, the moral, the inner voice that tells you don't do it.
I will go there with you and ask you, is there a relation? Is this, are those the same? Is it how?
You mean conscious and consciousness?
No, conscious. The term you
Okay.
agree.
Relation between it and
Self.
self. Well, in my account, which has remained incomplete, conscience, that is the moral self-regulation that has to be factored into strategizing in a cultural community. I mean, you cannot go, except paying the price, you cannot go strategizing, lying, obfuscating, deceiving, or even cooperating if you don't know the rules, the norms, the values of the community, which are part of the conscience. And my argument was that this conscience-based regulation, with a few further ingredients, is the source of the sense of me self, of this virtual displaced self, the self that shouldn't do that, or should do that, or it's a source of it. It's even a selection pressure, because conscience is directed. I mean, you cannot strategize. There are two main, I said there are two main parameters for having a sense of me-self, of this virtual displaced self. One is autobiographical, because this is a self that travels in time. Therefore, it has to be virtual and displaced, can't be this one, right? The autobiographical. And the second source is the conscience. Is this moral self-regulation and socio-cultural self-regulation and the attitudes of others toward you. Shouldn't forget those that are important in a group. That all converge to make you aware, sense of, to make you aware of, as George Herbert Mead put it, but he put it a bit too grossly for me, that you become an intentional object of your own internal attention. It's like you are a target, you, the me-self, a target instigated and pressured by the outside world, by the others, by the culture, by the morality. You become a target, an object. He uses it in a bit of philosophical sense, intentional target or intentional object. It's a more complicated construction. But this is a relation, I think. Conscience, autobiography converge in creating a sense of me-self in the context of this strategizing.
As you put it in the description, maybe strategize is a bit rough.
Rough?
It's a bit brute. I mean, it is, when you speak about conscious, it's a high level.
Well, conscious is only part of it. I mean, strategizing.
It is quite, I mean.
Well, you're quite right. This is exactly what it is. When you engage in diplomatic deception and a white lie, and so, which we do all the time, it's quite a low level like this. Yeah, so strategizing it is. I'm not going to change it. Yes, please.
Thank you for the lecture. I was just wondering, when we talk about the sense of sight, for example, we can say a person's sight is weak. Well,
A person?
Eyesight is weak.
Eyesight.
Okay, so
Yeah, mine.
first question, can the sense of self be weak or strong? And secondly, does the sense of self have an object, like an objective object, as in eyesight, for example? The object is still there, doesn't matter that a person can see it or not. Or is there a difference in the case of the self, meaning there is a stronger connection between the sense of the self and the constitution of the self?
Well, to the second, your question, I will only give, since it's from egocentric internal sense of self, I will give David Hume's answer. There is no entity, self, that the sense of self is about. In fact, I will go and say that is about something is a wrong grammatical philosophical construction. There is no aboutness, because there is no entity at the end of the relation. No, it's not a aboutness or intentionality relation. So there I will be with Hume. There is no self that you perceive inside you. So the first question, I think, is interesting, but I don't think it will fit in what I have to say. A strong sense of self, it's a ordinary language, ordinary concepts ways of describing, I think, something else. I don't know exactly what it will be. Fortitude, it will be resilience, it will be a bunch of psychological attitudes which are very important to a person, which we abbreviate, you are quite right, we abbreviate with a strong sense of self, and somebody might have a weak sense of self. But I don't think it comes close to what I was talking about, or indeed comes close to anything that you want to say about selfhood. I think it's packaging a number of psychological and behavioral propensities and attitudes, it's packaging and then putting a label on it, which is understandable, it's intelligible. We do this in ordinary language quite often with lots of things. But when you unpack them analytically or theoretically, you realize that they're about something else, very legitimate, very real, but not exactly what the label says. I will make this prediction about a strong sense of self. I don't think that self, almost in any philosophical account I am aware of, comes in degrees. I mean, it would be even hard to conceptualize this sort of thing. Well, no question. I thank you very much. You've been a very good and patient audience. Thank you very much. Sau poți să fii invers, tu ești suferit, poți să fiți. Foarte
Thank you.